Okay, welcome to the night flight. Please prepare for takeoff. Shout out to everyone in the live chat. We're going to kick back, talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. Take it nice and easy. Shout out to MT, LD, Ari, Black Incel, Kyle, Julius, Warren, Adrian, AAA, First Round Boxing, Samil, Andre Rodriguez. We got Agni in the place. We got Andy Hall. Fight Sport Talk, Johnny Rico, Debiaka. We got Ali in the place, Noctus, Sully, Afro Jam, big up Afro Jam, Rich Franklin, Anthony YouTube, Regulus. All right. So we can talk about some boxing stuff just to get it kicked off. So the conversation I've been thinking about is whether Alexander Usyk needs to be stripped of his belts right now. Now, for me, it's not really much of a conversation, but for other people, I'm sure they're going to make an argument that he shouldn't be stripped because of all that he's done and so on and so forth. But I'm not really big on legacy privilege. Alexander Usyk has been a fantastic champion, a modern day great. From a technical perspective, in terms of his skills, I think he is top 5, maybe top 3 of any era in the heavyweight division. But that's just my opinion. I'm not basing that on his resume. I'm basing that on what I think he could do in fantasy matchups. Be that as it may, rules are rules. And the heavyweight division has had far too many rematches during this era. Way too many. And this has led to a lack of variety when it comes to heavyweight championship fights. We're getting the same few fighters being recycled over and over again in a round robin situation. If you go back to the other previous golden ages of heavyweight boxing, let's say the 1990s or the 1970s, Lennox Lewis was fighting loads of different people, from Razor Ruddock to Tony Tucker, Frank Bruno, Oliver McCall, Phil Jackson, Oliver McCall again. He obviously fought non-title bouts as well after he got beaten by McCall the first time against people like Tommy Morrison, Ray Mercer. After he beat McCall in a rematch to regain the WBC belt, several fights after he lost it, he was fighting the likes of Henry Akin one day, Shannon Briggs, Željko Mavrovic. He then fought Holyfield. Yes, they had a rematch because the first fight was very controversial. It was a draw and most people felt like Lennox Lewis got jobbed. In a situation like that, okay, run it back. But running it back every single time, especially when it's, let's say, a mandatory challenger, there isn't supposed to be a rematch clause in the contract, you know? So anyway, there were far fewer needless rematches in the 1990s in the heavyweight division than there has been in this era. And same goes for the 1970s. Yes, there were rematches, but only when needed. Not needless rematches, and they spaced the rematches out more. So, for example, when Riddick Bowe beat Evander Holyfield in their first fight, there wasn't any immediate rematch. The rematch was like, well, Riddick Bowe had 2 fights after the first Holyfield bout. He stopped Michael Dokes and he stopped Jesse Ferguson, and then he fought Holyfield in the rematch. And Holyfield, in the meantime, had a rematch with, talk about rematches, he had a tune-up fight, is what it was supposed to be. The second encounter he had with Alex Stewart. Then he fought Riddick Bowe in their rematch. And then after Holyfield got revenge over Bowe, he fought Michael Moorer in his next, in his first defense of his second reign as heavyweight champion. Didn't just go right back in with Riddick Bowe again. So they spaced the rematches out to give us more variety, different opponents against the champion. Do you know what I mean? Similar thing in the 1970s when Joe Frazier beat Muhammad Ali, the first man to ever do so. It wasn't an immediate rematch. There was like a good deal of time between their first fight and second fight. In their second meeting, both guys were no longer champion. And neither guy was champion anymore. Joe Frazier had been annihilated by George Foreman. So it was two former champions fighting each other. Yeah, a while later. And then their third fight was even later still, several years after that. So they spaced it out. I don't mind rematches and trilogy fights. It's when it's consecutive, especially when it's for a world title, because it just holds the division up and denies us from seeing different styles go up against the champion. So for that reason, I want to see, if Alexander Usyk don't want to give the belts up right now, I want to see him stripped. Nothing against Usyk. You guys know that I think the absolute most highly of him. But I also like to see the division keep moving, not remain stagnant. And of course, Usyk has been involved in many of these needless rematches. The second rematch with Fury was unnecessary. Excuse me, the second fight with Fury, the rematch was unnecessary. The second fight with AJ was unnecessary. Usyk was mandatory challenger. He signed away his right to not have a rematch. Yeah, I do not like when these fighters are doing that, when they're signing away their right as mandatory challenger to sail off into the sunset if they beat the champion. So Usyk's partly complicit in that. Obviously, it was a load of money for him. Maybe that's why he signed it away. But from a fan perspective, I don't like it. So, yeah, Usyk's been participating in all these rematches. Let's get the heavyweight division moving again. We know who the best is. It's Alexander Usyk. He's the best in the world. He's the best of his generation. Let's get some other fighters contesting these belts now. And if Turki Al-Sheikh don't want Usyk to fight Joseph Parker, let's get a belt off Usyk and let's get Parker in there against somebody else then. You know what I mean? That's my take on it. What do you guys think? Danny says, would Usyk have a better legacy if he hadn't been forced to rematch Triple D, Fury, and AJ, and instead had 3 wins against the likes of Parker Caballel and Bacoli, for example? I think yes, definitely so. I can only agree. Rashid says, Hatman, do you think Fury did better in the rematch like me? Usyk has been saying the first fight was harder. Well, the first fight was harder for Usyk because he got hit with more meaningful shots. The second fight, from a physical perspective, was easier for both men because neither of them got hit with as many damaging punches second time around as they did first time around. So in that sense, it was easier for both of them physically. But I would say Usyk didn't have to work as hard to get the victory in the second fight. So in that sense, I can see why you're saying it was easier. Do you know what I mean? Even though he didn't manage to hit Fury with the same amount of really damaging blows as he did in the first fight, he didn't really need to because he was winning the fight without having to exert himself to the same extent and without having to take as many shots, like in those middle rounds in the first fight with Fury. I would say that Fury, not just Fury, both of them boxed better defensively the second time around. Yeah, both of them tightened up their defense in the rematch. So that's why it wasn't as good a fight. But ultimately, Usyk still closed the show down the stretch. He started hitting Fury with some clean shots. He actually wobbled Fury. Not as badly as he did in the first fight, but he did wobble him in the final third of the second fight. And Fury's gas tank just started to deplete. And that's when Usyk turns it up. When he notices you're getting tired, he's going to step on the gas. He's got that extra gear that he can kick it into. Shout out to Striker. Shout out to Mac B. He says, you've been right all along about not needing crazy power to be heavyweight champ. Usyk is a great example. If you have skill, heart movement, and IQ, you can do damage even without KO power. Yeah. And Usyk has enough power. Do you know what I mean? He's not feather-fisted. You don't need to be some kind of huge one-punch KO merchant. As long as you got enough power to keep the other guys honest, as long as you got the skills and all that to compensate for not being a monster puncher, it's no problem whatsoever. Ali says Usyk's power is underrated. Yeah, it probably is. Shout out to Andy Hall. He says, although forced into fighting Usyk eventually, Fury doesn't seem to fight anybody compared to all the previous top guys throughout history. Totally agree. And I sound like a broke record here, but I want to put a lot of the blame on Floyd Mayweather because he inspired a lot of this type of behavior. He made it cool within the boxing fraternity to behave like that, to try and bamboozle the public into thinking you're the greatest of all time when you haven't done the things that the previous greats had done. You weren't willing to take those type of risks. Do you know what I mean? Mayweather started all that nonsense. And that's why Mayweather and Fury have always been so cool, because that's always been Fury's like secret role model. That's what I want to call him. Yeah. Floyd Mayweather is Tyson Fury's secret role model. Luke Partridge. Let me stop calling him Tyson Fury. Andre says, I want to see the undisputed champ at least try to defend the undisputed once. It'd be cool, but he's defended the unified belts minus only the IBF. He's done that twice now. So, one more belt. I guess it'd be cool from a technical perspective. So you could say, okay, yeah, he became undisputed and he defended undisputed, but I don't think it's necessary for me. Agnes says, Lennox Lewis never defended undisputed. That's right. Because undisputed champions tend to get stripped quite quick in the 3 belt era. Although Marvin Hagler had 3 belts, and a little bit different back then, but I'm sure he had. Did Marvin Hagler defend the 3 belts? I'm sure he did. I don't think it was just the 2, because the IBF was new in the 1980s. So maybe that's why they weren't so quick to, strip you for not defending against their mandatory. Let me just double check on Marvelous Marvin. So I'm pretty sure he defended in the 3 belt era. Let me check. He actually didn't. Damn. Oh, hang on. No. I think he did. Hang on, because I'm on Box Rec. I forget they don't recognize the WBA. They're still doing that silly thing of not showing the WBA on their website. So bizarre. You call yourself boxing's official record keeper and you got no records of the WBA, which is literally the oldest sanctioning body. Anyway, let's have a look here. Yeah, he did. Of course, yeah, he defended the undisputed 3 belt several times. But again, because the IBF were relatively new back then, maybe that's why he was able to do so. But he was, as so many champions were back then, very, very active. So, for example, he won the world title against Alan Minter in 1980. That same year, he'd fought how many times? 4 times. He fought 4 times in 1980. 3 times in 81. Actually, after that, he wasn't as active. He was like fighting 3 times in a year. No, 3 times in 83. So towards the end of his reign, he started getting less active. But for the majority of his reign, he was fighting at least 3 or 4 times a year, which is more than most champions these days, right? Against different people, not recycling the same opponents over and over again. Ben Wilson says, I genuinely worry about Dave Allen's safety in his next fight, and if he does somehow manage to win that, he was fighting in casinos 3 fights ago. Eddie's trying to get him hurt. Well, according to Dave Allen, he picked the opponent, and he was given a list. So the list was, I think, Otto Wallin, Tony Yoka, who's already beaten him, and Arslanbek Makhmudov. Now, the way they're trying to sell it is that Makhmudov is the most dangerous and the most dangerous and hazardous opponent for Dave Allen. But I actually see it the opposite way. Even though Makhmudov is the biggest and, is he the biggest? I think Yoka's actually just as big, maybe a bit bigger, but he's the most powerful of the short list of opponents, but he's the least skilled by far. Yoka beat the brakes off Dave Allen. I doubt he would beat Tony Yoka in the rematch even now. I think Yoka's just got his number, to be honest. I know Yoka's lost some fights since that, some really, really awful losses, but yeah, Yoka's already beaten him. I think even, was Lenroy Thomas offered to him again? Surely not. But Otto Wallin would probably still beat Dave Allen, I reckon. If Otto Wallin's on form and he's really up for it, he'd probably beat Dave Allen. Makhmudov is the technically poorest, worst of the opponents that Dave Allen was offered. So, of course, he and Eddie Hearn are both trying to sell it like it's this real dangerous matchup. To me, it's an interesting matchup. I think Makhmudov will win, but he's so crude that it opens the door for Dave Allen to actually do something. I see this fight as maybe like a 60-40 in favor of Makhmudov. I don't see it as like a huge disparity between the two guys. Yeah, I do make Makhmudov favorite. I do expect him to win. But Dave Allen win is not out of the question at all, because he's going up against the guy who's very, very hittable, a guy who's been stopped twice. Okay, he was stopped by Caballero, who's proven himself to be a very capable heavyweight, but he was also stopped by Guido Vianello. That's a terrible loss. He got stopped by Guido Vianello 2 fights ago. If Guido Vianello is stopping you, Dave Allen's got a chance. But like I say, they're trying to sell it like it's the most dangerous thing ever for Dave Allen. I don't think it is as dangerous as they're making it out for him to be in terms of his health. I don't think so. Bexy says, Hearn makes people sound like Terminators. Yeah, he does. And that's his job, of course, right? He's a promoter. He's going to hype everything up. Shout out to Ed Ellaby. He's going to hype everything up and go overboard. Punches in Bunches. Love the name. He says, Dave Allen has slow feet. He has a good chance since they probably will swing in front of each other and plod a lot and get unbalanced a lot. Yes, that's what I'm expecting. It's going to be a slugfest. I hope it's a crowd-pleasing slugfest rather than a sloppy hugfest. You know, because when you got 2 slow-footed guys like that, 2 plodders who are crude, it can turn into something either really exciting and dramatic or something really ugly and slow. So let's hope it's the former. Shout out to Ocean Blue. Yeah, we're just taking it easy. Talking about boxing to kick things off, but we can get into any topic you guys want to get into. Obviously, keeping the algorithm in mind. I might have to use euphemisms and whatnot for talking about certain subjects. Debyaka says, when choosing between 2 crude dudes, Pick the bigger, heavier, crude dude. And indeed, that's why I'm picking Makhmudov. But I reckon Dave Allen will give it a decent account of himself. Oh, wow. Tosserman says Dave Allen seemed quite upset when he was told that he's officially a slight favorite over Makhmudov with the bookies. He wanted to be a clear underdog because, okay, it could negatively affect his performance. That's interesting. And you make a good point there, Andy Hall. Andy Hall says, I hope Dave Allen makes it interesting, but his output is so poor, I can see him just doing a survival and being outpointed. Yeah, that's a good point. His output is very poor. Very poor. Like, bafflingly poor. You watch so many Dave Allen fights and he's just not throwing any punches. He's not pulling the trigger. And you're like, what on earth is this guy actually doing? Like, is there a mental block there or something? Is this just a really poor example of pacing yourself? Like, what on earth is going on with this guy? Bexy says Allen will be overthinking everything now. And maybe you've hit the nail on the head right there, Bexy. Maybe Dave Allen overthinks in the ring as well, because you can see he's very, very introspective. Whenever you listen to or watch a Dave Allen interview or watch any of the videos on his channel, he's thinking out loud all the time in this perpetual mode of introspection. You know, he's constantly analyzing his own thoughts and analyzing his own behavior. And that's cool up to a certain extent, but you can get lost doing that. You can start to overthink about your own behavior and overanalyze yourself. And then it becomes a hindrance. And maybe that's what Dave Allen does in the ring. Maybe he just overthinks and overanalyzes things. Shout out to Kylie. He says, Dave Allen is a psychologist's dream. Yeah, it gives him plenty to go off. Ben Wilson says, I get you, Hatman. He's just so bad and already taken so much punishment. The next opponent after could really do him serious damage. Yeah, I mean, it's heavyweight boxing. Any opponent could do him serious damage, but I think he would have been in more danger of taking serious damage against a Tony Yoka, to be honest, because Yoka has more skill than Arslanbek Makhmudov. It's not just, you know, the punching power. Makhmudov is so crude, Dave Allen might actually be able to slip some of his shots. You know what I mean? Because Makhmudov is just so crude and slow. Like, Makhmudov is much slower than Johnny Fisher. He's a better fighter than Johnny Fisher, but he's much slower than Fisher is. Shout out to Omo. He says, started listening to you when I was in uni, Hatman. Now I'm 30, engaged, and about to have my first kid. Time flies. It does indeed. It's all over before you know it. Although, it's just starting for you, my friend. Congratulations on the child to come. Shout out to D-Man for the super chat. He says, what country in Africa did you pick to live? I won't reveal that here. Once I move, I'll reveal it on Patreon. All I can tell you is it's a socially conservative country, as most African countries are. It's south of the equator. And it's quite a big country geographically. It's pretty big. So I'll say that for now. Yes. Shout out to D-Man for the super chat. And English is the first language. There you go. I'll give you that as well. Shout out to Debiaka for the super chat. He says, 2 high-profile Japanese boxers died from injuries sustained on the same card recently. RIP. Investigation needed or just an ugly coincidence? Okay, that's, yeah, very unfortunate. I'd have to look into the cases to be able to form any kind of any kind of real views on it. I have to look into that. I didn't even know that 2 fighters passed away on the same card. That's crazy. Obviously, coincidences can happen, but fatalities in boxing are relatively rare from a statistical perspective because there are like 24,000 active male boxers, and that equates to thousands of fights every year. So statistically, it's quite rare for somebody to die or get serious injuries. Therefore, if you've got 2 people dying on the same card, it seems statistically improbable, doesn't it? Because if it was something that happened on a regular basis all around the world, then okay, a coincidence like that would seem more likely. But since it's relatively rare, it's like, how can 2 people die on the same card? Maybe it was an issue with refereeing. Maybe it was an issue with weight making in that country and the rules and regulations around that. Maybe it was an issue with, God knows what. But that's a very, very ugly situation indeed. Shout out to Deb Yarka for the super chat. Shout out to Anthony YouTube. He says, I can definitely relate. Been watching Hatman's vid since uni and I'm now 31. Oh, wow. Striker says, and there was a Japanese boxer who died on the Inoue undercard a year ago. Big up EJ Boxing Live. What's happening, my bro? One thing I can tell you about Japanese boxers is that they are, Vader D's beat me to it. They have a real warrior spirit. I mean, they really are the type of guys that go out on their shield. We've wondered, or I've wondered, what happened to the samurai spirit, Because you think of Japanese culture these days and it's an emasculated culture. At least that's the perception I have of it. It's an emasculated culture. But when it comes to combat sports, you see the old, Japanese samurai warrior spirit. Because those guys will go out on their shield. They're ridiculously brave. And it's been like that for as long as I can remember watching Japanese fighters. Do you know what I mean? They're ridiculously brave. So that might also have something to do with it. Shout out to Agni. He glassed me. Yeah, that was a hilarious episode in British boxing. Obviously, it happened in Germany, but it was 2 British fighters in David Haye and Derek Chisora. It was one of the highlights of the Klitschko era. Actually had nothing to do with the Klitschkos. I mean, it was at a Klitschko post-fight press conference, but in fact, what are the highlights of the Klitschko era? The Haye-Chisora brawl at that press conference in Germany, Haye spitting water in Vlad's face, slapping Vitali, and also Shannon Briggs trolling Vladimir. That's basically the entire highlights of the Klitschko era. Ezra says Lennox Vitali, but that wasn't really the start of the Klitschko era because Klitschko wasn't the champion at that point. So you could say that was maybe a crossover point, because Klitschko, Vitali had lost the WBO belt to Chris Bird. So he was a challenger against Lennox Lewis, and he, didn't come away with a victory that night either. So I want to say the Klitschko era proper started when he got a belt, his brother got a belt, and it was the 2-headed monster, the Towers of Power. And if we count it from then I would say, yeah, the highlights of the Klitschko era were Shannon Briggs trolling Vladimir, David Haye and Chisora brawling. He glassed me. Yeah, that was hilarious. Let's go, champ. Shout out to Gorguga in the chat. Haye knocking out Chisora better than Usyk knocking out Dubois? Yeah, I'd say so. I think Dubois is a better fighter. But if you're talking about just how dramatic the knockout was and the punches landed, I'm sure the Hayes shots were probably harder shots, but Usyk's shots were hard enough. Oh, wow. Vader D says, in sumo wrestling, serious injury and sometimes fatality is accepted as part of the sport. That's the mentality there. They respect the sumo wrestlers, but do not cry over it, seeking change repeatedly. Okay, I didn't even know that sumo wrestlers die. Is it that dangerous? I had no idea that sumo was that dangerous. I guess if somebody fell badly or something and hit their head whilst getting pushed over, I mean, maybe, but damn, the sumo wrestlers die? Shout out to Rich Franklin. Andrew Grimbass says, Miller versus Briggs press conference would be nice. Yeah, two big trash talkers, although Miller kind of looks up to Shannon Briggs. He's like his big bro. Maybe that's where he got his connect for all the PEDs, because Shannon Briggs was popped several times. The first time he got popped, he tried to blame it on his asthma, because, you know, certain asthma inhalers contain steroids. He tried to blame it on that. Oh, there you go. Debiaka says sumo deaths must be heart attacks considering the size of them, right? Okay, Vader D says sumo deaths are from falls. I didn't realize how mad sumo was until seeing it waiting for a Japanese boxing card to start. They fall pretty far. It's not just flat ground. And they're massive guys, right? They have a special diet, I guess an extremely high carb diet to sustain their enormous size. It's a sport which is, how can I describe it? Indicative of, or you know, the product of a very decadent culture. You've got fat wrestlers, not hungry, you know, ripped wrestlers, but fat wrestlers. The culture must be very decadent if the wrestlers are all big fat guys. Debiaka says sumo wrestlers get nice ladies. That's a cultural, but then again, yeah, if they're making money, then anyone could get nice ladies if they're getting money, so it makes sense. Shout out to Agni, he says, could Hay beat Klitschko if they weren't in Germany? No. That fight showed me Hay just did not have the technical know-how nor the size to be able to deal with Vladimir Klitschko. David Hayes' whole shtick at heavyweight was too basic, circling around and jumping in with a big right hand or the occasional left hook. You need more than that to beat somebody like Vladimir, who's got better technique, you know, better footwork. He's got that jab. He had all David Hayes' punches and angles covered. You know, if somebody the dimensions of David Hay were to beat a Vladimir Klitschko, he'd need better technical acumen. He'd need to rely less on his athleticism and more on technique and setting traps. I mean, Corey Sanders was similar dimensions to David Hay. And Corey Sanders set traps. You know, he laid a trap for Vladimir Klitschko. Klitschko walked right into it, and Corey Sanders sprung the trap, took him out in 2 rounds. But he weren't going to fall for those same things all those years later when he fought David Hay. And David Hay isn't as good at setting traps as Corey Sanders anyway, in my opinion. Big up Fight News. What's up, what's up? ATL GA in the house. Andrew Grimbass says, Vladimir crumbled like Dubois when he got clipped. Yeah, Vladimir didn't handle pressure in the ring very well. He did fall apart. Kind of like AJ as well. AJ's cut from that same kind of cloth. You know, when he gets hit and hurt, it's just all downhill. He doesn't recover well. Big up Rich Franklin. Yes, we've only gotten 29 likes on this one. That's crazy. 197 concurrent viewers, only 29 likes. Damn, what did I do wrong? Hit the like button, guys, if you would. Thank you in advance. Let's try and keep these likes. Let's get the likes up to like 100. Keep it at a nice 50% of the concurrent viewers. All right, if you guys want to talk about anything other than boxing, we can go there. You guys want to talk about movies, about music, whatever you want to get into. The paranormal, I don't know. Matt B says, Balogun, who is he really? 41 and got KO'd by Gassiev in 2. McKean is trash. Whack was tough, but 45. We don't know how Atama will look against a top 15 heavyweight, and sparring is sparring, right? Well, I would agree with all that except for McKean. I mean, you can say McKean is trash, okay, but he did go nearly the full distance against Hrgovic. So we have a yardstick to compare. And Atama blasted McKean out in a round. So we can't ignore that. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, your point is well taken. Atama has fought nobody so far. Dillian Whyte is very much a step up. And he looks to be in good shape. He looks to be taking this very seriously. I think Atama's got the power, if he lands clean, to end the fight at any point. But I'm expecting this fight to probably go rounds. And contrary to what most other people seem to be saying, what the kind of narrative seems to be, I reckon the longer the fight goes, the better it is for Atama. I don't think the longer it goes, the better it is for Dillian Whyte. I think the longer it goes, the better it is for Atama. Just like the longer the fight went, the better it was for Joseph Parker, right? He dropped Dillian Whyte, what was it, in the final round? The longer the fight went, the better it was for Anthony Joshua. The longer the fight went, first time around, the better it was for Alexander Povetkin. The longer the fight went, the better it was for Mariusz Wach. You guys remember when Mariusz Wach hurt Dillian Whyte late in their fight? So the longer the fight went, the better it was for Tyson Fury. I mean, Tyson Fury was winning all along, but he started landing more cleanly the longer the fight went. Because Dillian Whyte's construct, his shape, breaks down quite quick. Because he's not a very good athlete. He's not very well coordinated naturally. And Moses Atama is the opposite of that. He's very well coordinated naturally. So once Dillian Whyte's boxing construct starts to break down and he starts getting more sloppy, there are going to be more opportunities there for Atama to tag him. And also, by the mid-rounds, a lot of that aggression, if Dillian Whyte is swinging and missing, will have left him at that point. He won't be quite as fiery. I'm expecting Dillian Whyte to be very fiery in the early rounds. When he swings that hook, he's going to be looking to take Atama's head clean off his shoulders. You know how Dillian Whyte used to throw that hook, right? So I'm expecting to see a lot of ferocity from Dillian Whyte in the early going, and that might make Atama uncharacteristically cautious, because he's going to be like, wow, this is different. I've never been in front of somebody this spirited before in 10-ounce gloves. Yeah, in the gym, I'm sure he has, but not in 10-ounce gloves without the headgear under the bright lights. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the first 2 or 3 rounds, Atama is somewhat cautious and, you know, wants to maybe draw Dillian Whyte's sting a little bit. But as I say, as the fight progresses, I think it's going to get worse for Whyte because he's going to get more sloppy, Atama's still going to have that coordination about him, that speed, and he'll find it easier to punch in between Dillian Whyte's shots, capitalize on his poor footwork, make him fall over his feet like he did with Balogun, stuff like that. Paleo says, who is taller? I feel Whyte is. I think they might be about the same height, or Atama's possibly a shade taller. In fact, that's a good point. There hasn't been a face-off, has there? We haven't even had a press conference for this fight. How weird is that? Am I buzzing here? Am I tripping people? Or have we not had a press conference for the fight? How weird is that? No kickoff press conference. Or did I miss it? Maybe I missed it. Somebody please tell me. Was there a kickoff press conference for this fight? There wasn't, was there? Fight News says Whyte probably opted out. They're saying presser is coming soon. Yeah, but we're talking about fight week presser. There's always a presser on fight week. I mean a kickoff press conference. You know when they announce the fight and they have a kickoff press conference? It's like they didn't even do one for this fight. How weird is that? So that's normally when you would see what the guys are like. Who's taller than who, you know? That's really strange. Shout out to Ben Odom. He says, good evening, Hatman. Do you think Chisora has snookered himself, turning down a $2 million payday, and now doesn't seem to have a big payday on the horizon? Turkey has closed the bank. It depends on how you look at it. Derek Chisora might feel like he wants a win for his 50th fight. And if he genuinely doesn't think he's got a chance against the Atama, then he's done the right thing. Because he's made a load of money anyway. Maybe it's not just about the money at this point. He's a little bit sentimental for his 50th and he wants an opponent who he thinks he's got a good chance of actually defeating. Ed Ellaby says Chisora wants a title shot. And if he was to lose to Atama, he's lost to a prospect. If he's to lose to Usyk in a title shot, well, he's lost to somebody that's already beaten him before, so it doesn't really hurt him any. And obviously there's more to gain from a title shot than beating Atama at this stage anyway. There are a lot of people disputing Atama's height. I'm not sure because I haven't seen Atama next to enough people to be able to really gauge his height. But there was somebody in the Element, it was either in the Element group or in the live chat on a previous live stream, who said they saw Atama in person and they said he's at least 6'4". I think the individual who said they saw him in person in London somewhere said that they themselves are 6'2", and that Atama was towering over them. So I'm not sure. He's kind of a stocky build, Atama, you know? And when someone has that kind of stocky build, they can seem deceptively short. Okay, Telstar says, I've seen him in person. He looks 6'3"-ish. Shout out to Bobs for the super chat. He says, Atama is very wise for his age. Catches out NPCs. Yeah, Atama is not an amazing orator. He's not a great speaker. He's not as bad as Dubois or Joyce or anything like that at speaking. But, you know, he's kind of monotone and whatnot. But if you actually listen to a lot of his responses and the things he says, yeah, you can tell there's some intelligence there. But it's kind of masked by that monotone demeanor that he's got. But if you actually listen to the things he's saying, he's brighter than you might think or expect. Niall says Atama getting arrogant for me. Oh, arrogance is all good if you can convert that into wins. You know, continue winning with the arrogance. All good. You need a big ego to succeed in boxing. LD says it's mad that a 20-year-old would smash all of us in here. Okay, interesting question from Andrew Grimbass. He says, 20-year-old Usyk versus this Atama, who wins? This Atama. I don't think a 20-year-old Usyk was even a heavyweight, was he? I mean, I don't think he was even a cruiserweight by the age of 20. He might have been a light heavyweight or something. Yeah, Grind says he fought Beterbiev when he was around that age. So that would have been light heavyweight, I think. No, I think he fought Beterbiev twice. One of the fights, I think, was at heavyweight, which is the equivalent of cruiserweight. The other one might have been at light heavyweight. Because he beat Beterbiev in one of the fights and then he lost to him in the other. Anybody seen any decent movies lately? 2025 has not been well, which years are great for movies these days? You know? We're starved of good movies. I've recently been re-watching Tenet. When I first watched Tenet, I found it so confusing that I didn't like it. But the more I watch Tenet, the more I actually like it. The story is actually very simple, but the physics is kind of confusing. And I'm not completely convinced that the physics actually works, you know? And that's why there's kind of a funny line early on in that film where this scientist tells the protagonist, don't try and understand it, just feel it. And it's as if that was an instruction to the audience. Don't try and understand the physics. But yeah, I do quite like Tenet. Is there 4DX movie theaters in the UK? Yes, there is. I'm not really a big fan of that 4DX thing where they're blasting you with air and water and you know, those chairs that are like being on a roller coaster or something. I'm not really a fan of that. So basically, Tenet, for those who haven't seen it or don't understand it, spoiler alert, it's about basically a battle between humans in the future and humans in the past. And the way that humans in the future are interacting with the past is to reverse the entropy of objects and even people, so that those objects no longer travel forward in time, but they travel backwards in time. So an inverted person, they call them, you know, inverted people or inverted objects, will walk backwards, right? Everything they do will be backwards. An inverted bullet will fire backwards. So when you pull the trigger of a gun, the inverted bullet will go into the gun. So again, it's very, very like mind-bending physics, and you wonder if this actually works from a logical perspective. But yeah, that's essentially the whole plot and premise of the movie. And the guy who's been tasked with destroying the world in the past is a Russian oligarch played by Kenneth Branagh, who has to get hold of something called the algorithm, different pieces of this algorithm. And once he's assembled all the different pieces, he can then basically destroy the world. They don't explain why humans in the future want to destroy the old world. It's never really explained, at least not as far as I can discern from watching that movie several times. But that's the plot. So it's like the protagonist, played by Denzel Washington's son, is an individual who becomes a major player in the world of espionage, and I guess maybe he owns some kind of mercenary company, I think, maybe in the future. But he is moving forward in time, but some of his men from the future are basically moving backwards in time. And they, meet him, and they're not allowed to actually say that they already know him because it could mess up the timeline and all that kind of thing. Guess, you know what time travel movies are like. It all gets a bit complicated with the grandfather paradox and all that stuff. Shout out to Copzilla for the super chat. He says, everything is a remake today. We've hit a rut. Yeah, except for Chris Nolan movies. Chris Nolan doesn't really do remakes. Has Chris Nolan made any remakes? Almost says, Hatman, are you excited about Odyssey, Chris Nolan's new film out next year? I'll definitely give it a look. What's it about? There's also another director who I quite like, the guy that directed the Dune movies, and the guy who directed The Northman, The Lighthouse, Nosferatu. I forget his name. Ed Ellaby says, any thoughts on the Ben Shalom Boxer BBC deal? Eggers, thank you. That's his name. Robert Eggers. That's right. He's the one that did The Lighthouse and The Witch, The Northman. Yeah. I quite like his work. But where was I at? Oh yeah, Ben Shalom, Boxer BBC deal. Well, we need more details to come out. I did see a couple of interviews with Ben Shalom. He did one on TalkSport, and he's playing his cards very close to his chest. He indicated that the big fights, like pay-per-view level fights, will not be on the BBC. Presumably they'll be on DAZN, maybe Sky, maybe TNT, We shall see, but basically the BBC is going to be for non-pay-per-view events. Eddie Hearn came out and said that he received some type of, I forget exactly how he described it, but he received some type of communication from the BBC because they apparently reached out to him with a view to helping out on these Ben Shalom shows in some capacity, right? As far as the promotion and stuff like that. And Eddie Hearn said he thought about doing it, but decided not to. Anyway, he says that they revealed to him that it's only going to be like 3 shows or 5 shows a year. This is what Eddie Hearn claims. Make of that what you will. Yeah, on the production side. That's right, Ed Ellaby, yeah. On the production side. Yeah, the BBC is good exposure for young talent without a shadow of a doubt. But how much young talent does Ben Shalom actually have now? Because there's been rumors that the likes of Adam Azim and so on are going to leave. Yeah, now Murphy hit the nail on the head. That's pretty much what 95% of Hollywood movies are now. Rich says Blade Runner 2049 was slow and overall dead. Yeah, I watched it at the cinema when it came out and I wasn't really a fan. I thought it was bloated, like overly long. But on second and third viewings, I was like, all right, I liked it a bit better. What I can say is I love the aesthetic of it. The way that they've replicated the aesthetic from the original movie. And they tried to go for a slower pace deliberately, again, to also replicate the original movie. I'm not really a fan of all this fast-paced, like, schizophrenic editing in a lot of new movies, especially in, like, action movies and thrillers and stuff like that. The editing is just too fast for me. It just gives me a headache. It doesn't give you enough time to process what's actually going on the screen with these constant cuts and shaky cam. I'm really not a fan of that type of filmmaking. So I did appreciate the much longer shots in Blade Runner 2049, which was what I was used to growing up in the 1980s and the 1990s. There wasn't all this like ridiculously fast cuts and what have you. So I prefer that in terms of the editorial style. But overall, the movie did drag. But there was still a lot of moments I liked in it. I thought it was a good performance by the lead actor. I liked the whole, what do they call that test now? I forget the name of the test. When K, whatever the name they give the main character who's a replicant, he's an android. They give him a baseline test, but there's another word that they use for it in the original movie. I can't remember Ryan Gosling, yeah, thank you. That's the name of the actor. So that baseline test, which has another name, Whyte Kampf test, thank you, Demswood, yes, the Whyte Kampf test. So I liked the way they did the Whyte Kampf test in Blade Runner 2049. It was much better than the Whyte Kampf test in the original Blade Runner. Because they get him to recite that poem and they get him to repeat certain words over and over again to see if it would trigger an emotional response out of him. Ayed says Gladiator 2 suffered from that. Yeah, I tried to watch Gladiator 2 and I was just bored out of my mind. I couldn't get through it at all. Ayed says, have I seen it? Yeah, I tried to watch it last week or the week before maybe. I was bored out of my mind, bro. I just could not watch it. Whereas Blade Runner, I was able to watch it. I've watched it several times. It's one of those films where I like certain sections of it. But other sections drag a bit and I get a bit bored. But there are parts of Blade Runner that I really like. I want to say maybe the first 20 minutes, 30 minutes maybe of Blade Runner are quite engaging. Kylie says, films like Apocalypse Now could never be made today. Yeah. Apocalypse Now is a pretty slow-paced movie, but there's constant battles throughout. And there's the intrigue of what lies at the end of the river. So I never got bored watching Apocalypse Now. It's one of my favorite movies. Because it like builds up to this crescendo. Do you know what I mean? It's based on a book called, or one of the things it's based on is a book called The Heart of Darkness. And that's literally what you're traveling into as they travel up the river. It's takes place in during the Vietnam War. And Yeah, I love like the 80s synth music and how everything just gets darker and more dreamlike the further they go up the river. And by the time they reach the destination, it's totally surreal. And that's obviously done deliberately by Francis Ford Coppola. He wanted it to feel like a dream by the time they reach the destination. Yeah, the horror. That's right, Rob Smith. He knows. The horror. And I do like the dialogue between Willard and Colonel Kurtz at the end of that movie. I do like the exchanges and the dialogue between them. Hey, it says, Hatman, what do you think of the Joker's origin? Or what do you think the Joker's origin was in the Dark Knight X Army? No idea. You'd have to ask Nolan. If he even knows, It's left deliberately ambiguous. And one of the things I liked about the Joker in the Dark Knight is that he really pushes the ambiguity, because in one scene, when he's explaining how he got those scars on his face, he says that he cut his face himself because his wife suffered some type of scars, right? I think she got mugged. Was it she got mugged or fell in debt somehow? I can't remember, but yeah, he says his wife had those scars, so he cut his own face so he could be like her, and then she couldn't stand the sight of him. But later on in the movie, he says that his dad put those scars on his face. So he like contradicts himself. Yeah, they leave his origins deliberately ambiguous. That's right. You want to know how I got these scars? My father was a drinker and a fiend. You know the way the Joker talks. Let's put a smile on that face. Why so serious and all that? Okay, Bob says he wasn't a fan of the plantation scenes in the extended version of Apocalypse Now. Felt like it slowed down the pace too much. Yeah, I can definitely understand that. Although I quite liked them. I quite liked that, the plantation scenes. But only because I liked the movie so much, I just wanted to see more, if that makes sense. Because I liked Apocalypse Now so much, I was like, if only this movie had extra stuff in it that I could watch. And then they came out with the extra scenes in the director's cut on the plantation and what have you. So, yeah, being just a massive fan of the movie, I like the scenes, but I can totally understand why somebody wouldn't like them. Yeah, Redux is relaxing. That's what they call it. Apocalypse Now Redux. It's relaxing. Kylie says Robert Duvall was great in that film. Yeah, he was great. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory. It's a great line. Yeah, Copezilla, that's right, with the Joker. With the magic trick and the pencil through the eye. Copezilla says, I like the Judge Dredd movie, the newest one. They're actually making a new one again as well. Yeah, the new one, the newest one, it came out maybe a decade ago with, is it a Kiwi actor? Yeah, that's quite good. I saw that in a cinema in 3D. It was pretty good in 3D. You know when they're throwing people off the balcony? That part in 3D was like, good. Yeah, with the slow drug, that's right. I like that Judge Dredd a lot better than the Stallone version. I'll tell you that. The Stallone version was corny as hell. But the newer version, Carl Urban, thank you, yeah. Carl Urban. The newer version with Carl Urban was more gritty and less cheesy. It's a shame they didn't do a sequel. You say they are doing a sequel for that version, that universe of Judge Dredd, or are they just making a completely different? Copezilla says, but back then cheesy was the thing. That movie came out in the 90s, didn't it? The Stallone movie. In the 90s, cheesy was kind of going out of style. We were tired of cheesy by the 90s. Cheesy was really an 80s thing. We accepted cheese in the 80s, but by the 90s, we were like, nah, man, like, the 90s is a cool era. The 80s was kind of like, you know, footloose and fancy free and cheesy, and it wore its heart on its sleeve. In the 90s, it was more like a cool era. And we were tired of the cheese by then. We wanted to move away from the cheese. Bob says that era of Stallone reminds me of Demolition Man with Wesley Snipes. Yeah, somehow those films get muddled up in my mind. Demolition Man and Judge Dredd, because they were so similar tonally. I often get them mixed up in my mind. Kylie says, I heard Miller Anderson is in doubt now. Well, Jarrell Miller claims that Anderson is not fighting at all. To be fair, he said that Anderson appears to have, an issue with Top Rank. Copezilla says, so does Street Fighter with Van Damme, same outfits and vibes. That is one of the worst films to have ever been made. Is Street Fighter with Van Damme. One of the worst movies in history. Absolutely shocking. He had not Uncle Fester. Who's the dad in the Addams Family? He played Balrog, or M. Bison, excuse me. He played M. Bison. He played M. Bison. Shout out to Black Dynamite in the chat. That Street Fighter movie was so bad. Gomez, thank you. Yeah, Gomez. That movie was an abomination. Exactly, Kylie. One of the greatest games and one of the worst films. Marlo says, the storyline of that Street Fighter movie was way off. The storyline was way off. The casting was way off. The acting was way off. The effects were way... Everything was way off. It was just horrible. It was shocking. Almost says, recently watched the old Jason Bourne films. Very good. Yeah, the first two were cool, but I really didn't like the third one. And I don't remember much about the ones that came after that, but one of the reasons I didn't like the third one is something I spoke about a few minutes ago. The editing was just so schizophrenic, fast-paced, jump cuts and shaky cam, and oh my God, no. That movie just gives me a headache, man. Too many cuts. Too much shaky cam. See, it's one thing to be doing a load of fast cuts, but to be doing like Parkinson's level shaky cam at the same time as the constant fast cuts, I find it unwatchable when movies are filmed and edited in that way. Cobzilla says, favorite Van Damme film was Lionheart for me. It's got to be Kickboxer. Yeah, Kickboxer. Cheesy as hell, but hilarious from start to finish. Everybody remembers Van Damme's unbelievably cringe dancing in that bar scene. And he still gets requests to do that dance even now. Yeah, that's crazy. That scene is just so 80s, so cheesy. And the funny thing is, right, and only in the 80s could they get away with this. Van Damme's got like the thickest Belgian accent ever. And yet they keep calling him American. Do they have some kind of dubious backstory to explain his Belgian accent in that movie? I forget now. But they keep referring to him as American. And they ask him right before he starts dancing, can you dance? He's like, yeah, I'm a good dancer. And then he starts doing all that. Madness. Rosby says, I preferred Bloodsport to Kickboxer, but both cheesy classics. Yeah, Bloodsport has got that hench Chinese guy in it. I forget his name. What's the big hench Chinese? Bolo. Yeah, Bolo. Because he was also in, was it Enter the Dragon he was in? I think it was Enter the Dragon, Bolo. So he fights Van Damme in Bloodsport, right? And then it's Tom Poe, who must have been the inspiration for Sagat in Street Fighter. Tom Poe. He's the guy who he fights in Kickboxer. Kylie says, no wonder it ended in a bar brawl. I know, that kind of dancing would induce a riot, you know? Ezra says, Ben Whittaker leaving Boxer. Yeah, rumors, but I haven't seen anything confirmed yet. Unless you can confirm it for me. Carlos says, Hatman, did you dislike the shaky cam from the movie Cloverfield? I don't remember much about Cloverfield. I think I watched it like once or twice. I actually had that on DVD, but I never liked the movie. Hey, Ed says the Cloverfield in the underground shelter was good. That was called like Cloverfield Lane, wasn't it? It was quite an interesting psychological thriller, that one. Not a film I'd necessarily want to watch twice, but it kept me engaged while I was watching it. And yeah, I probably did prefer that one to the original, which was like just a big monster movie. Dems Wood says, Hatman, I highly recommend the Raid films. Greatest martial arts films ever made. Well, the thing you have to understand about me when it comes to martial arts films is I like them cheesy. If a martial arts film is not like comical and cheesy, I'm probably not going to like it. Because I'm not one of these people that just likes action for action's sake. I'm not really a big action fan. Be it, action fight scenes or car chases or any stuff like that just doesn't do anything for me. So when it comes to martial arts films, I like them to be ridiculous, funny. I like the terrible dubbing that they would do with the old kung fu movies. You know, all that kind of stuff entertains me. I liked Kung Fu Hustle. That's a relatively new, I say relatively new, it's probably like 20 years old or something now, but for somebody as old as me, it's relatively new. My favorite Kung Fu movie of all time is called The Buddhist Fist. And there is a YouTube channel which has a load of old Kung Fu movies on it in high quality. And The Buddhist Fist is on there, the full movie, last I checked. So yeah, my favorite Kung Fu movie of all time is called The Buddhist Fist, which again is farcical and hilarious from start to finish. It's got bizarre characters, you know, funny dubbing, and weird behavior from the characters. You know, when they just do random stuff. Hey, it says, did you watch Event Horizon, the horror movie in space? Yeah, Event Horizon was good. It's a good movie. Dark sci-fi. Big up Charles B in the chat. EJ says, Drunken Master 1. Did Drunken Master 1 have Jackie Chan in it? Did it have Jackie Chan in it? Drunken Master 1. Obviously a very young Jackie Chan at the time. Charles B says, what are we discussing? At the moment, movies. At the moment, movies. Carlos says, Hatman, how is the dating scene in Costa Rica? Depends if you speak Spanish or not. It depends what you're looking for. But most gringos in Costa Rica date other gringos rather than Costa Ricans. Peter Marshall says, Kung Fu Hustle is a classic. Yeah, Kung Fu Hustle's good. That's right. The Shaolin monk from the Buddhist Fist, I guess you mean like the master. Callie says, reminded him of that character from Virtua Fighter, the drunken master. Indeed. Was probably inspired by that character or something very similar. Now, Ticos, as in Costa Ricans, don't tend to call you gringo like that. That's maybe more of a Mexican thing, I don't know. But when you're gone, they'll call you a gringo, right? But not that it's an insult, but, you know, just means foreigner. Charles B says, how's the move going? All ready to go? Almost. Not too long now. Bob says, Jackie Chan's stunts in Police Story are great. He sang the theme song. Wow, I didn't know that. He sang the theme songs. I had no idea. Yeah, he was good in Police Story. In Police Story, is that the one where he jumps onto that giant hot air balloon off a cliff? Because there's one stunt in a Jackie Chan movie where a man jumps off a cliff on top of a hot air balloon. I was like, damn, that's crazy. Shout out to AJ for the super chat. He says, find the new John Wick film so boring. The super extended repetitive action sequences with very little story, etc. Yeah, those films are just not for me. Stuff like John Wick, it's not for me. I'm not really a big action fan. The only exception I would make would be like The Matrix, which is action sci-fi, because The Matrix is so multi-layered. You know, there's so much going on. There's so much mystery and intrigue and all that. it's not just mindless action. But movies that are just action for the sake of action with a flimsy story just to string it all together, it really doesn't do much for me. Not unless it's hilarious, you know? It has to be literally hilarious for me to want to watch a movie like that. Is Costa Rica worth the move for a bilingual British brother? Depends what you're looking for. I would say, you know, take a trip out here. You know, see if you like the vibe and what have you, and it being bilingual makes it a lot easier for you. It's a very, very laid back, chill vibe. Very, very laid back. It's like, in fact, how can I describe Costa Rica's like, Costa Rica is littered with surf towns. That's what you have to understand. There's loads of surfer towns in Costa Rica because a lot of these, Americans, Canadians, and people from Europe as well come to Costa Rica for surfing, and not just the actual surfing, but the surf vibes, surf town vibes, beach bum vibes, and that type of thing. So, Anthony YouTube says, which is scarier, space or the parts of the sea that haven't been discovered? I'd have to say space. Yeah, space. Cobzilla says, was Costa Rica always a stepping stone? Yep, it was always a stepping stone. It's always a stepping stone. Because space, as far as we know, is infinite, right? And if it's infinite, then there's infinite possibilities of what could be out there. Also, you could say you can't breathe under the ocean, but you can last a lot. The ocean isn't as deep as space, right? So, got more chance of making it out of the ocean than you have of deep space. Okay, Bob says that might be Armor of God with the hot air balloon. Police story is the one where he's hanging off the side of a bus and nearly died sliding down the pole in the supermarket. I also remember the Jackie Chan movie Wheels on Meals. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is Wheels on Meals the one where there's a fight in the movie and he turns into these like Street Fighter characters? I think that's Wheels on Meals. Yeah, I've seen City of God way back in the days. Seen City of God, but I always preferred Sotsi. Sotsi is a similar movie, but it's South African, not Brazilian. Anthony YouTube says, but only 7% of the sea has been discovered. God knows what's there. Yeah, it's not much, but even less of space has been explored. Not even a fraction of a percent. Andy Hall says, seeing as that we're talking movies and boxing, is anyone interested in the new Hamid Ingle movie coming out? I can't decide. I'm not particularly interested in it. I don't find Nassim Hamid nor Brendan Ingle that fascinating that I want to watch a movie about him. I know it's starring Piers Brosnan as Brendan Ingle, Who's playing Prince Nassim? I think I did see like a still image or a clip of the person playing Prince Nassim, and I just laughed. But that was a while ago. Almost says Adam Deacon. Are you sure? Adam Deacon's playing Prince Nassim. Maybe that's why I laughed. let me check that out. Is Adam Deacon playing Prince Nassim? That's a madness if he is. Yo, is Adam Deacon playing Prince Nassim? That's wild. Okay, he's trolling. I was going to say. I would have been mad if it was Adam Deacon. Because the person who I remember seeing didn't look like Adam Deacon, but maybe because he was made up. But now you're saying you're trolling, it's not Adam Deacon anyway. Ayed says, I don't know the actor's name. He's usually in a lot of stuff, but never the major character till now. Rob Smith says his name is Amir El Masri. Rupert says, my favorite movie sequels of all time. Top 5 will be Terminator 2 Judgment Day, The Godfather Part 2, Empire Strikes Back, Aliens, Back to the Future Part 2. That's a good list. Some honorable mentions might be Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. What else could go in there in terms of great sequels? Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers has got to be there. Big up Jay Hurst. The Dark Knight, of course. We've been talking about that as well. Definitely The Dark Knight needs to be there. One of the greatest sequels of all time, no doubt. Yeah, Empire Strikes Back was in his list. So Rupert's list is Terminator 2, Godfather Part 2, Empire Strikes Back, Aliens, and Back to the Future 2. Yeah, he's got those ones in there already, Godfather and Aliens. He's got them in there. I'm trying to think of something that's not on his list. Shout out to D-Man for the super chat. He says, you see Fleece Johnson on Drewski's show? No, I haven't seen Fleece Johnson on Drewski's show. Did Drewski go in on him? Let me know that Drewski went in on Fleece Johnson. I've seen Fleece Johnson on a bunch of other shows. On some Pop the Balloon show. And in fact, was that the Drewski one? I don't recall seeing Drewski on it though. And obviously, Fleece Johnson does interviews on, what's that channel called? Hustler Spirit? Kyle says Drewski ain't funny. I haven't seen that much of him, but I did see that viral clip where some African guy came onto his show. And the guy told him that he was like 27 years old. And the guy looked more like 47. And Drewski's reaction was literally hilarious. He was like, 27? You're 27? That clip was damn funny. Huh? And he asked the guy, what do you do for a living? And he's like, I'm a content creator. And he said, you need to stop doing that, man. It's aging you like fuck. Yeah, that clip was hilarious. He ripped into that guy for looking old. Tosserman says the guy playing Naz trying to do the Yorkshire Arab accent in the trailer is so off. He sounds half Scottish, half London. Bronson got Brendan down pretty well, though. First Round Boxing says, Hatman, do you have any hip-hop album recommendations? I'm a casual. I like Biggie. Okay, well, you're casting a very broad net there because there are so many albums, but since you like Biggie, which is relatively hardcore stuff, something a bit more hardcore but still very listenable and engaging, I would say is Onyx Shut 'Em Down. Yeah, try the Onyx Shut 'Em Down album. The reason I recommend that album is because it's very well produced and there's a lot of story tracks on there. Because Biggie used to tell stories in a lot of his tracks, and Onyx are fantastic storytellers. So the standout tracks on there, one of them is called Veronica. That's a storytelling track. And the other one's called Rob and Vic. So, yeah. Onyx, Shut 'Em Down, which for me is their best album. So check that one out. I think you can probably listen to the whole album on YouTube. A lot of those old hip-hop albums from the 90s, yeah, they're all up on YouTube. So check out Onyx, Shut 'Em Down. It's like a, hardcore street album, but it's very polished and done very well. Charles B says, Hatman, do you still play Prison Architect? I haven't in a while. It's probably been maybe 2 months or so since I played it. I actually talked about it on a live stream. Last time I mentioned it, I got, ribbed a little bit for being a wannabe screw. But there is something enjoyable about playing that game. I'm waiting for the sequel to come out, actually. Because there's a sequel in the works. And, yeah, I'm looking to get into that. Being a prison warden all over again. Sending the riot squad in to crack some skulls, and the prisoners start acting up. Charles B says you would like Crusader Kings. Okay, what kind of game is that? Cobzilla says currently playing God of War 3. That's my favorite God of War game, is God of War 3. Obviously, it's best in the remastered version where you can play a solid locked 60 frames. But even the original version on PS3 was close to 60 frames for a lot of the game. That's one of the reasons I liked it back then, because the 60 frames per second game on PS3 was a rarity. Obviously, COD ran at 60 frames. But most like AAA titles were not anywhere close to 60 frames. But God of War 3 certainly wasn't locked, but it was there or thereabouts, right? And it just made it feel more immersive to me. So yeah, for me, God of War 3 is my favorite of the God of War games. Okay, Charles B says it's like a strategy game. You start a dynasty and you have to take land and build your empire up. Okay, so it's like Age of Empires, one of those kind of games. One of those, like, yeah. Regular says, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you go online with the PS3, you're not able to buy the DLCs? Is that right? I haven't played PS3 in so many years. I couldn't confirm. Demswood says, I'm going to lose sleep with GTA 6. That game is going to be mad. Yeah, GTA is really the biggest game in gaming, isn't it? At this stage, in terms of like sales, is there anything that sells more than GTA? Pretty sure there isn't. Although, I'm not really a massive GTA fan myself. I find the GTA games cool, but I don't know, the characters to me are all a little... It's like the imagination of a teenage boy. Do you know what I mean? The characters, and just doesn't really appeal to me like that. Charles B says, I tried turning England into a pagan country, but the Pope sent a crusade and made me convert to Catholicism. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it will do that. The stuff that the Catholic Church used to do was crazy back then. They'd impale people on spikes and all sorts for resisting the good Lord. I remember an ex-girlfriend of mine had these comic books. And these comic books were like an expose of what the Catholic Church used to do to people in Europe and whatnot. In like Germania and whatever. And these were like, illustrated comics of people being impaled on spikes and all the crazy, and this is based upon like real accounts, and all the crazy punishments the Catholic Church used to mete out for anyone who opposed them. I don't know where she got them comics from. Afro Jam says there hasn't been a new GTA in a few generations of consoles. Yeah, because GTA 5 came out on PS3 and Xbox 360. And all they've been doing is remastering that game every generation. I mean, talk about milking it. Unbelievable, isn't it? How many times have they remastered GTA 5? Unbelievable. Danny says, which other boxers changed their names? Loads of boxers changed their names. Dwight Muhammad Karwi was originally Dwight Braxton. There was a British light heavyweight. Well, see, a lot of fighters used to use ring names. So they didn't necessarily change their names legally, but they would have a ring name, right? A name they would use when they would fight, different to their actual name on the passport and the birth certificate. That was very common in the early 20th century. That's where things like Kid used to come from. You'd often hear boxers, rather than having a first name, call themselves Kid something, Kid this, Kid that, right? Sometimes it would be like a middle nickname, like Ted Kid Lewis, but other times it would just be Kid and they wouldn't reveal their first name. But yeah, a lot of fighters had ring names. So for example, there was a British light heavyweight from, I think, Leeds called Crawford Ashley, but that was his ring name. His real name was Paul Crawford. He actually used to spar Peter Fury. And Peter Fury said that's the hardest he's ever been hit, is when he used to spar with Crawford Ashley, aka Paul Crawford. Evil Uncle Phil says, I can't believe these PS5 games are £100 on average. £100? I don't think they're that much. Maybe some of the deluxe versions or whatever, but I think the standard price is like £70, isn't it? 60 or £70. Ed LB says Rocky Marciano is not his real name. Well, his surname is Marciano as far as I'm aware. But yeah, Rocky is not his first name. Evil Uncle Phil says I'm referring to PSN store prices. Yeah, even PSN store. I don't think it's like that. Unless you're buying a deluxe version or something. I don't think it's £100 a game. More like 70, 60, 70. Charles B says there's a zombie game coming out called God Save Birmingham. I'm not even going to talk about Birmingham anymore. I'm not even going to go there. But that's a crazy name for a game. God Save Birmingham. I mean, Birmingham needs all the help it can get. So if God has to intervene, I'm all for it. Yeah, same as Ayad is saying there. The £100 are usually like the deluxe editions. Yeah. It's not normally the standard price of a new game. A new game is like £70, I think. Between 60 and £70. Ed Ellaby says, no, Hatman, his surname isn't Marciano. Look it up. Oh, okay. I stand corrected. Because in the early 20th century, believe it or not, boxing was, because I want to say, I'm assuming, because of the heavy criminal element, being a boxer was not a respectable profession for a lot of people back then. And that's why some boxers used to have ring names. You know, they wouldn't use their real name because they didn't want the people who knew them to find out that they were boxers. So they'd use, like, as I say, ring names, like stage names in acting. Although in acting, people use stage names for different reason. If your name just sounds rubbish, it doesn't sound like it would sell very well, then you change your name to something that sounds more catchy. That's the reason for stage names. But in boxing, it's slightly different. I mean, there's an element of that too, I guess, of having a more sellable name. But a lot of the time back in, as I say, the early 20th century, it was people who wanted to hide from their friends and family that they were boxers, or their neighbors or whoever, people in their community, because it wasn't seen as a respectable thing to do. It was a dirty, murky world full of criminals and mobsters and, well, yeah, fixed fights. And so many of the fighters would work for the mob as debt collectors and enforcers and stuff like that. So a lot of people from respectable families didn't want to be associated or felt ashamed to be associated with something like professional boxing. Well, Adam Azim is not called Adam, is he? So that's another one. What's Adam Azim's actual first name? Because Adam is there's a version of it. Well, Adam is actually an Arabic name, or do they spell it slightly different? Because they do use the name Adam in the Arabic speaking world. And that's why a lot of these like Muslim guys, as in Adam Azim, they adopt the name Adam because it's a name that works in the Muslim world and also in the West. Ayed says, why was Azim getting criticism for getting married? Sign of the times, innit? Sign of the times, bro. Sign of the times. There's a war on the family. Striker says boxing itself was semi-legal. Yeah, it was definitely flirting on the edges of the law. Charles B says, remember the days of going to a video shop to rent a game? The good old days. Video shop or even Blockbuster, because they had a great selection at Blockbuster. LD Phoenix says, Undisputed is hot garbage. The worst game I've ever seen. Yeah, can't say I played it or had any inclination to. Vader D says, Kid Galahad. Yeah, Kid Galahad, his real name is Abdul Bari. That's right. I think his family are from, is it Oman or Qatar? I forget where his family are. Is he from Oman or Qatar? Danny says, do you think the Abrahamic God is a demon? I'd rather not get into the religious stuff today. But all I would tell you, because whenever we start talking about the Abrahamic God, you know, people get riled up who are believers and all that, and I don't want to rile people up with that. But what I would say is, me personally, just as an individual, I feel uncomfortable following a deity that demands that much devotion. That's all I'll say. I don't know. That was a crazy question. Afro Jam says the Abrahamic God will punish your YouTube page. Jupiter String says Abrahamic God, the demiurge, Hatman. Well, that's what the Gnostics believed, right? Indeed, leader of the Archons. That's what they believed. Andy Hall says Barry Galahad has gone straight off the radar. Yeah, after he got chinned by Kiko Martinez. Did they have a rematch after Kiko Martinez chinned him? Linkage says, Hatman, did you play the Arkham games? I tried, but I just couldn't get into them. Not really a fan of comic book stuff, you know? Big up Charles B. for the Wives Fund, indeed. Yes, Charles B. I was literally just speaking to one of the upcoming wives right before the stream. And the conversation would make you laugh because I told her, look, I'm going to marry several women. And she's still trying to persuade me that she will be enough for me and I don't need to marry others. So that's literally the conversation we were having right before the stream. Yes. So that will go towards the bride price. Thank you, Charles B. I'll go towards the bride price. Because you got to pay these things, you know? Got to pay the family money. Yes, the Wives Fund. That's right. Jupiter String says, Hatman, I read that testosterone levels reduce the urge to socially conform, mirror in groups, laugh at jokes, etc. Makes so much sense. Yeah, it does make sense. And it also makes sense of the fact that the current generation are less rebellious than previous generations. I'm talking about the young. Because testosterone levels are going down. it's like there's no real counterculture anymore. You know, like back in the 60s and the 70s, going into the 80s, there was like punk rock and there was all this like anti-establishment sentiment among the young. Nowadays, it doesn't exist. Do you know what I mean? It just doesn't exist anymore, or there's very little of it compared to back then. Now what passes for anti-establishment is fully corporate funded and backed. Ayed says, what foods help with testosterone? Well, I'm no nutritionist, so all of this stuff is just me guessing using, I guess, my logical deduction and stuff like that. But I would think things like eggs, certain types of nuts, and also staying away, plenty of exercise, yes, but staying away from sugar. Staying away from things like sugar. Also, milk contains a lot of estrogen, so you might want to limit the amount of milk that you're consuming. Evil Uncle Phil says, not being Frank Smith helps. Jupiter String says, sunlight. Oh yeah, sunlight will help with testosterone levels for sure. Get plenty of sunlight. Big up Charles B. That's probably tickled me, you know, for the wife's fund. Yeah, polygamy ain't easy, bro. All those bride prices you got to pay. That's the thing. When you go down that route, the traditional African route, or even in parts of Asia, they have polygamy. Yeah, you got to pay bride price. In some parts of the world, they call it dowry. You got to pay money to their family, to the girl's family. And if you're taking more than one wife, it gets costly. So yeah, got to save up for this stuff, you know. Because you're means tested by the family. I'm not sure how exactly it's done. I don't have to declare every bank account I've got, right? Keep some bank accounts secret. But it's apparently like means tested in terms of the amount of money they charge you. You know, the woman's family. Yes, Charles B. It comes at a cost not for the faint-hearted. Yes, auditors. Yeah, they the woman's family will look at your finances, and based upon how much money you make, they'll decide how much to charge you for bride price. I better put all my money into crypto right now. I got some of it in crypto. I better put a lot more of it in crypto. Hide it away. Yeah, it's all very new to me. Coming from a Caribbean background, we don't have anything like this. We don't have any like polygamous marriages, bride price, and all these like customs and formalities you have to go through when you're marrying an African woman. You have to approach the family, and you don't just say, I want to marry your daughter. You have to say something like, there's a flower in your house. Or, you know what I mean? You have to use all these like euphemisms. It varies from tribe to tribe, but one of the ladies I'm speaking to, she was explaining to me, this is how you're supposed to approach my family. You say there's a flower in your house and this and that. And then you need like negotiators to come and sit down with the men from her family and sit across the table and this is when we negotiate the bride price and all this stuff. Shout out Danny. He says, do you know any boxers who dabbled in the dark arts? That's a good question. Boxers who dabbled in the dark arts. That is a very good question. It's possible that Alexander Povetkin dabbled in what some people would refer to as the dark arts, right? We're talking about sorcery. Sorcery is seen as the dark arts from an Abrahamic perspective, right? But most non-Abrahamic religions practice some form of sorcery, magic. Alexander Povetkin practices some pagan European religion. Not sure if you guys know this. Yeah, he's not a Christian. He practices some kind of like pre-Christian Russian pagan practice. And that, I have to imagine, involves rituals and some form of magic and whatnot. So maybe Povetkin. In fact, let me look up Povetkin's religion. Because a lot of that kind of stuff became very, very popular after the fall of the Soviet Union. Okay, so Povetkin is a rodist. Never heard of that before, a rodist. Personal life, where are we at? Anyone know anything about rodism? It's some kind of pagan, I want to say, European religion. So Povetkin will be classed by Christians as a heathen, right? Where's this information? I was hoping it'd be on his Wikipedia page. But it says here, Alexander Povetkin practices rodnovery. That sounds crazy. A modern pagan religion. Okay, so it's modern, based on Slavic nature faith, which draws from archaeological and historical sources, folk religion, and other traditions. Okay, he identifies as a rodist, stating that his Slavonic heathen belief system is closer to him than Christianity. Povetkin has expressed his religious affiliation publicly, and his faith is reflected in his personal symbols, including a tattoo of the Star of Rus on his inner left bicep and Perun, or a Perun axe necklace he wears. He also has a tattoo of, is it Svarog? A figure from Slavic mythology on his left arm. So there you go. If you want to call it dark arts, yeah, Povetkin practices. And he's open about it. He's not hiding it. Charles B says, Alex Pereira practices something that involves rituals. Yes, that's right, because he's from one of the indigenous tribes, isn't he? So he would, yeah, he would. He'll be practicing stuff like that too. Kali says, sounds a little fruity. Yeah, sounds crazy. Carla says, did the dark arts help him to chin Dillian Whyte? Who knows? Shout out to D-Man. He says, do a lot of people misunderstand magic? I don't know. All I can tell you is that I'm open to the possibility that magic in and of itself is not inherently evil. I mean, there are types of magic which I would describe as inherently evil, where they're sacrificing people and all that nonsense. But there are many other forms of magic, as I understand it, which are designed to heal, so on and so forth, protection, spells, and all that type of business. And so I would tend to suspect that magic is like a knife. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. It can be used to help you survive. It can be used to help you prepare food, or it can be used to kill somebody with, right? It's a tool which can be used for good or for bad. It isn't in and of itself inherently evil. That's what I would suspect, okay? But since human beings are so selfish and corrupt, it also makes sense to me that the Abrahamic religions would ban the use of magic. It makes sense to me that they would ban it, because when people are allowed to use it, they tend to use it for bad, perhaps more often than they use it for good. Shout out to Danny, says, does paganism make cartels as vicious as they are? Well, I've got a theory. It's not even a theory, it's a hypothesis about the cartels, and that is that some of the vicious behavior which you see from the cartels is like a psychological legacy of the old Mesoamerican bloodthirsty empires like the Aztecs. It's like a continuation. Do you know what I mean? Like culturally and psychologically, it's like a continuation of that energy from their ancient Aztec ancestors, which has been carried on now by cartels. Do you know what I mean? That's my hypothesis on it. Because a lot of the, if you look at Mesoamerica, ancient Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and whatnot, obviously in Europe, the similar thing was going on, although not for religious reasons. It was just like brutal punishments as a deterrent, right? Whereas with the Aztecs, they were doing brutal stuff for religious reasons as well as for punishment. And they really wanted to make a spectacle of it, It was done on top of pyramids with like thousands of people watching, and they're cutting hearts out and drinking blood and all this grisly stuff. The cartels similarly enjoy spectacle. If they have somebody who rats on them in some little town somewhere, village somewhere, the person is like tortured to death in front of everybody. They all would do it publicly. It's out in the open. Afro Jam says, as gruesome as the Aztecs were, the Spanish were worse. In terms of the number of people that they killed, yes. But the Spanish, as far as I'm aware, were not doing the kind of sadistic, ritualistic sacrifices, do you know what I mean? Or to the same extent that the Aztecs were, right? Obviously, the Spanish had just fought off the Moors in Europe, so they were like battle hardened and ready and vicious from that. And as much as, there were conquistadors and this, that, and the other. And obviously, I'm not advocating the genocide and all that, but when you read the stories of what the conquistadors did, it's pretty remarkable. Do you know what I mean? Because think of the heart it takes for a few hundred Spaniards to go into like what would have been Mexico at the time and get guided to this city. And the first thing they show you is people getting their heads cut off and hearts pulled out and all that. And you see that and you're like, we're going to conquer these people. Yo, That's supposed to scare the bejesus out of you, you know? But somehow them, man, were like, nah, man, we can take these guys, even though they've got the numbers. And if they capture us, they're going to march us up that pyramid, cut our hearts out. Yeah, and you know, some of the conquistadors, it did happen to them. They did get captured and butchered up in the top of the pyramid. Yo, so the people that lived in that time were just so much harder than we are. They were so much more difficult to frighten, you know? Imagine seeing stuff like that and crazy. Nah, no doubt the Inquisition was extremely brutal. Extremely brutal. No, for sure. The Middle Ages and, you know, Renaissance, early Renaissance. It was a brutal time in Europe for sure. Yeah, hung, drawn, and quartered was a terrible thing indeed. But as I say, they were doing terrible things. They just weren't doing it on the scale that the Aztecs were doing it in the Maya. Because the Aztecs and the Maya were doing it for religious reasons. So they were more fanatical about, you know, getting those executions in. Sacrifices as they saw it. Kylie says, Aztec rituals driven a lot by psychedelics. Yeah, I would strongly suspect so, yes. You know, the king or the chief or whoever he was would have a vision in a psychedelic state, and he would come to the conclusion, we need to sacrifice more people. Afro Jump says, it's all the narrative of the victors. I'm aware of that, right? But there's loads of archaeological evidence for, you know, mass ritual human sacrifice conducted by the Aztecs and the Maya. I mean, there's depictions of it. It's just what they did. And that's one of the reasons that that woman called Malinau betrayed, is it Moctezuma? She betrayed him to the Spanish. One of the reasons is because the Aztecs were so damn brutal. Do you know what I mean? With all the sacrifice and all that kind of stuff. Because as they were coming to the end, because, you know, the Aztec Empire was coming to the end even before the Europeans arrived. And the same with the Mayan Empire. The Mayans and the Aztec civilizations were coming to an end. And because their civilizations were declining, they went into like overdrive on the sacrifices to try and appease the gods and stop all these bad things that are happening to their civilization, the crops failing and all this upheaval in society. They just went into overdrive. It was almost like a mass psychosis thing, thinking they can human sacrifice their way out of the decline of their the decline of their civilization. You know what I mean? And that's one of the things. I mean, again, it's weird that in quote unquote Christian Europe, they were hanging, drawing, and quartering people, because there's no place for that kind of stuff. There shouldn't be any kind of place for that stuff in Christianity. But as I say, they were not going to the same extent as far as just snatching up people to execute, because they're not trying to appease a god with these executions. Do you know what I mean? They're just basically trying to intimidate would-be usurpers, making an example of them by executing them in these brutal ways. Whereas with the Maya and the Aztecs, because they have this, you know, pagan belief system, it's the sacrifices, you know, the killings are motivated by something else. It's not just about intimidation. It's literally about appeasing a god, a bloodthirsty god. And so the point I really want to make is, I'm trying to be objective here, right? The Abrahamic religions basically put they basically put the brakes on out and out human sacrifice. Do you know what I mean? Particularly Christianity. They put the brakes on it. They didn't stop horrible executions throughout Europe and all that. But you have to pay some kind of, basic adherence to Christian ideology if you're running one of these Middle Ages, Renaissance countries in Europe, whereas in a pagan context, you don't. Because it was a brutal world back then anyway. Afro Jam says the empire lasted under 200 years. Yeah, that's right. The Mayan civilization lasted longer. And that's one of the reasons that I am of the view that a civilization which is, predicated on that level of evil, it can't last very long. It can't last very long because most people are not innately psychopathic. So if you're bombarding them with all this like brutality, do you know what I mean? All this crazy human sacrifice and all this kind of stuff, it's only a matter of time before a civilization like that collapses. So the Aztecs were known to be a lot more brutal than the Maya, but even the Maya towards the end of their civilization, they started doing all that human sacrifice and whatnot. They started ramping all that up as well because again, they felt as though their civilization was coming to an end. Yeah, Mayans still exist, but their civilization doesn't exist anymore. Telstar says, I see it as quite feasible that a lot of the laws set in these religions were common sense at the time, but then were taken advantage of by humans being humans. Yeah, of course. Of course. It's like the stuff to do with witchcraft, in like the atheist world, anti-witchcraft laws and provisions against witchcraft and all this kind of stuff is frowned upon by atheists. They're like, how backwards, they were doing this and that to witches. Yeah, what you don't realize is that a lot of witches were like sacrificing babies and stuff like that. That's the reality of it, bro. I'm not saying all of them. Maybe a minority of them, but there was a decent minority of them that were doing stuff like that. So you can understand why there were provisions put in those Abrahamic religions against sorcery. Because a lot of people misusing it and up to all sorts of no good. Yeah, it still happens today. Indeed it does, Jupiter's string. Indeed it does still happen today. But what I'm saying is that's one of the reasons that, the Abrahamic religions clamped down on sorcery, because they were like, this has got to stop. This is totally out of control. People are sacrificing individuals all over the place. We need to pump the brakes here. We need to pump the brakes. And in fact, somebody mentioned Robert Eggers, the name Robert Eggers, in the movie The Witch. Any of you guys seen the movie The Witch? It's based around some Puritans, some Puritan European immigrants in America, I want to say in the 1400s or 1500s. And that depicts that type of thing, in The Witch, the movie The Witch. It's a good film. It's got, Finchy from The Office, the UK version of The Office, the best version. Finchy from The Witch. He stars in it. Well, yeah, one of the main characters anyway. Bob says, yeah, good movie. The actor playing the dad has the deepest voice ever. LD Phoenix says, do you believe magic is real? Well, people definitely use it. I guess you're asking me, do I think it works? I think it works at a psychological level, at the very least. Does it work with unseen forces? I mean, I'm open to the possibility, but at the very least, it works on a psychological level, or it can work on a psychological level, in my opinion. Charles B says, I'm glad you said the UK office is the best. Too many people claim the US is better. The US version isn't even close. The US version is like slapstick, you know? One of the reasons that the UK version was so good is because it was so close to reality. It was only slightly, like, the first time I saw The Office, because I don't ever recall there being big fanfare when it first aired. And at that time, fly-on-the-wall documentaries were very popular. So the first time I saw it, I thought it was like a fly-on-the-wall documentary until I saw Ricky Gervais, because I'd known Ricky Gervais from, was it the 11 o'clock show, whatever it used to be called? Sacha Baron Cohen used to be on it as well. When I saw him, I was like, oh, okay. Maybe this is not a fly-on-the-wall documentary, but they didn't get too absurd. I mean, there were absurd moments, obviously. But especially in the first few episodes, it was like so close to reality. That's what made it funny. Yeah, it was bleak, deliberately bleak and depressing. And they tried to go for that with the American version in season 1, but apparently American audiences didn't like it. Shout out to KB for the super chat. Big up, big up. That's right, Devin. Americans prefer comedy to be bold and more obvious. They don't like dry, subtle, or realistic humor as much. And that's why the UK office was so funny, because it was so close to reality. You know what I mean? It was so close to reality. It was supposed to depict that bleakness that so many people experience working in those kind of jobs and in that, you know, little towns where they don't really have much prospects and they just accept their depressing lives. And it depicted that very, very well and finds humor in it, you know? Afro Jam says sarcasm and slapstick is not their strong point. But that's what not so much the sarcasm, but the American office was just purely slapstick. Literally, you know, pies in the face and cream pie in the face. I might need to put a pause on that. But, you know, Laurel and Hardy type slapstick. That's what the American office was. Totally on the nose. There's nothing subtle about it. NDO Media says science has debunked a lot of the witchcraft and mystic way of thinking. That's one thing, along with Abrahamic religions, was a good thing. I don't necessarily... Well, it has debunked some things, of course. Yes, science has debunked some things that people used to believe. But there are many things that science can't explain, which mysticism has plausible explanations for. As does religion. You know, the existence of consciousness, for example. Out-of-body experiences. So on and so forth. Science has never come close to offering plausible explanations for why these things exist. And this is why a lot of those Renaissance men are still so revered now, because they didn't separate science from spirituality. And I think wise people won't try to separate science from spirituality. You know, they'll see it all as one big sea, one big soup, rather than trying to separate things out like that. Because there is, I mean, you know, science is always limited by our understanding and the instruments and the apparatus that we have at any point in history. And so there's this dogmatic tendency within scientific thinking to assume that something can't exist or doesn't exist if we can't detect it. But that in itself is actually unscientific. Do you know what I mean? That way of thinking is unscientific. The kind of Renaissance guys had a more genuinely scientific mind in some cases, because they didn't limit their sense of the possible to the extent that a lot of like mainstream science does now. Oh, we can't detect it with our instruments, so it obviously doesn't exist. Well, you couldn't detect gamma rays 300 years ago, but they still existed. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, there are certain things that science has been able to debunk, but yeah, I'm kind of skeptical of so-called scientific types that totally dismiss spirituality, the materialist reductionist types, because there are so many things, as I say, that science cannot explain. So we have to keep an open mind. Not that we have to believe things, because belief is the enemy of knowing, but we have to keep an open mind. If you're a genuinely scientific-minded person, you're open-minded. Afro Jam says, psychology is a science to you, yay or nay? No, you can't call psychology a science because you can't quantify anything in psychology. You know? You can't quantify emotions. How do you measure anger? There's no measure where you could actually measure it. You know what I mean? How do you measure happiness? You can't quantify these things. At the end of the day, psychology is just the interpretation of human behavior, human words and behavior. You're interpreting human words and behavior. Also in psychology, there aren't standardized terms with standardized definitions. Different psychologists use terms in the same term in different ways. So you can't class it as a science, but that doesn't mean it's not important. Psychology, I would argue, is one of the most important things for somebody to comprehend and study and meditate on. Like having a great understanding of psychology is fundamental to the way the world is run. We talked about this in previous streams, right? The people that run this world understand psychology better than anybody else. That's why they run the world. Or how else could a tiny few be in charge of billions? Because they understand human psychology. That's why they're up there. They understand human psychology and how to manipulate it. Bob says psychology studies are very statistics-based though. Yeah, they are now, which I find quite sinister, to be honest. I mean, you might say it's an attempt to try and make psychology look more like a science. But I would say getting away from things like psychoanalysis is a step backwards. I think psychoanalysis is very, very, they have things like applied psychology and whatnot, but I think psychoanalysis is a very, very useful thing. Devon says, a point to make against the gamma ray example. Before they discovered them, they surely had no basis for a theory of their existence, so they would have been right to not believe such things existed. Why would they be right to believe something didn't exist, which actually did exist? That's my whole point. If you're closed-minded to the possibilities of what might exist, then you're not thinking scientifically. The individual, whoever it was that discovered gamma rays, I don't know if he did it accidentally, but would probably have been somebody who was open-minded enough to think that such a thing could have existed. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, your mind has to be open to be able to discover new things in the first place. There has to be some type of impetus to create instruments that can detect other things, right? Yet undiscovered forces and phenomena. If you think nothing else exists outside of what we can currently detect, then you're not going to even try to push to create technology that can detect other things. Do you know what I mean? So like a truly scientific minded person is going to be open-minded as far as the possibility of what could exist. But again, yeah, most people would have said, oh, such things can't exist because we can't detect it. But this is not this is not true scientific thinking. Shout out to D-Man. He says, what song have you hated at first then loved? What song have I hated at first then loved? God, there might be no song I hated at first then loved. No, I can't imagine there's a song I hated at first then loved. No, I can think of off the top of my head. How about you? Is there an example that you've got? Devon says because they would have had no evidence until they found at least some evidence. But you're missing the point, Devon. The point is, in order to find evidence, you have to be looking for it. And if you don't think that it exists, then you're not going to be looking for it. Do you understand what I'm saying? You have to have an open mind to even be wanting to look for these things. If you've got a closed mind, then there's no impetus to look. That's the whole point. That's an unscientific mindset when we say, oh, such a thing doesn't exist, so, because we don't have any evidence for it. Imagination is the most important thing in science, not evidence. Yeah? Imagination. Imagination is what allows you to think outside the box, explore different possibilities. And that's when you come up with hypotheses. And then you create experiment to test the hypotheses. And through a process of trial and error, you'll find out whether the hypothesis is true or it's not true. Yeah? A good scientific mind is an open mind, a mind that doesn't have limits, a mind that doesn't say, oh, well, it doesn't exist because we can't prove it at the moment. That's not scientific. This is dogmatic thinking. It's not scientific thinking. So a truly scientific mind will be a mind that says, rather than saying this doesn't exist or that doesn't exist, it's a mind that says we don't know if such things exist. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, we don't know. That is more like a true scientific mind, not a mind that's, oh, this doesn't. That's why I kind of laugh at a lot of the materialist, reductionist, atheists, I love science types, Because their minds are just as dogmatic as the religious people who they seek to ridicule all the time. They're just as closed-minded and dogma. Human beings love, one of the things I discovered in my life is that human beings love dogma. It doesn't matter whether it's religious dogma, political dogma, and even dogma in science, right? In the scientific community, in the atheist community, most people love dogma. And I think it's because dogma gives people a sense of stability and certainty. It gives them like a sense of clarity, that they have answers. Most people don't like to just be floating in space and not know. They don't like, like Socrates is once said to have said, wisdom is knowing, the only true wisdom is in knowing I know nothing. Most people are not comfortable with that mindset. They want certainty, and this is why they cling on to dogma. If we can't prove it through our tests and experiments, it doesn't exist. And anyone who says it does exist is crazy. I mean, that's the best way to stifle progress, is to think like that. I mean, the best way to actually achieve progress is that dogma is comfort. Telstar summed it up perfectly. Dogma is comfort. Yeah? Dogma is comfort. A truly scientific mind cannot be dogmatic. It's open to infinite possibilities. And that's how you actually progress. A maverick in science will get a notion in his head from his imagination. And he'll say, I think that this is the way reality works. And then he'll go on a quest to try and develop experiments to prove his hypothesis. And sometimes he won't prove it in his life. He'll start work, which other scientists in future will piggyback off of and build upon. And eventually, hundreds of years down the line, he'll be proven to be right. Yeah? But it takes that spark of imagination in the first place, going against the grain, going against conventional wisdom, going against the dogma and what have you at the time, to dare to imagine things beyond the consensus view. Oh, in practice, it's not really like that, Devin. In practice, atheists are extremely dogmatic. They're extremely dogmatic because, and I'm not saying all atheists, I'm saying the vast majority I've ever encountered are extremely dogmatic because they are adamant, for example, you look at Richard Dawkins, they're adamant that, for example, consciousness doesn't survive beyond the body. They have no evidence for that. They have no proof for that. They have no experiment where they can show that consciousness doesn't survive beyond the body. But they believe it as a belief. It's a dogmatic belief. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, literally came out and said it. That, there is no life beyond the death of the physical body. How does he know that? What science has he done to come out and make a statement like that? So, no. Most atheists are dogmatic, and that's why most atheists are so hostile towards religion. Yeah? That's why they're so hostile towards religion, because they believe that there is nothing like a God. They believe that there is nothing like spirits. That's a belief. It's not something you can prove. Yeah? As an agnostic, I know that you cannot prove the existence or non-existence of God. That is something which is just a logical reality. You can't prove it, you can't disprove it. That's why I don't get angry at people who believe in God. I can't prove it and I can't disprove it. How can, do you know what I mean? There are so many inexplicable things about this reality. For all I know, maybe a God did create it all. I don't know. That's the open-minded position that an agnostic would take. Most atheists are not like that. Most atheists don't have an agnostic position. Their position is spirits definitely don't exist, gods definitely don't exist, and they just seek to ridicule people who believe that they do all the time. And this again is like indicative to me of just dogmatic thinking. NDO Media says, you're right, Hatman. However, science is primarily based on evidence. It also develops as time goes on, hence why the knowledge of black holes was absent. Yeah, but the point I'm making is to prove something in science, yes, you use experiment, you use evidence and experiment. But in order to actually have the impetus to prove something, you are going to need to have imagination in the first place. Do you know what I mean? If nobody has any imagination, there will be no scientific discoveries. It's just that simple. Everything starts out as a thought, an idea in somebody's head. Everything starts out that way, long before you've got any evidence, right? It starts out as thought in your mind. And then, based upon that thought, it gives you the impetus to try and test this thought, test this hypothesis. And it's a process of trial and error, of testing your thoughts, testing your imagination, you know, to see whether you can prove it. And just because you can't prove it now, it doesn't mean centuries in the future they won't be able to prove some of the things that you suspect to be true now. The point is, you have to have an open mind to ever make progress in science. You cannot ever think that we know everything, and if something can't be proven now, it doesn't exist. That is literally unscientific thinking. I mean, if we take it to the metaphysical level, we can never know everything, right? If you think about it metaphysically, we can never know everything. There's always going to be more to know. If there's always more to know, then you have to keep a perpetually open mind. There's always more to know. We can never know everything. So our minds must always stay open, because if they don't, we become dogmatic. And as somebody said earlier on, dogma is comfort to people. Comforting. Devin says, the thing is, scientists don't rule something out, but they don't believe something before they see evidence. But to believe in something that hasn't been discovered yet would be like claiming to... No, you're kind of mixing two things up. There are many scientists who believe something which hasn't been proven yet. That's how they get the impetus to create experiments to prove it in the first place, because they believe something, or at least they suspect that something is true. Yeah? There's nothing wrong with suspecting that something is true, or even believe. Many scientists have done that. There's a difference between believing something and claiming it to be fact. That's where you're kind of getting things muddled up. Yeah? Scientists are not supposed to claim something to be fact until they can prove it with experiment and evidence. Yeah? But there's nothing wrong with them having a hunch, believing something. Again, that's where they get their impetus to then conduct experiments from. John J says, not out of thin air though. Yes, out of thin air. Yes, out of thin air. I mean, many inventors, right, have come up with innovations whilst being high on psychedelics. This is a fact. Steve Jobs was doing loads of LSD. Kary Mullis, the guy who came up with the PCR technology, he was doing all sorts of psychedelics when he came up with that. He spoke about it in his book. Right? People go way out there into their imagination, and they get ideas, they get a notion that something just intuitively makes sense to them. This is how they speak about it. Yeah, if you ever hear Kary Mullis or any of these people speak about these things, they get some kind of notion from the depths of their imagination. And there's just a feeling inside their soul that this is going to make sense of the things I've been looking at. I don't have any evidence for it right now, but just subconsciously, this seems to make sense. And once they start testing it, they discover, oh yeah, it does make sense, and now I can prove it through experiment. That is how progress is made. Progress is not made by people who sit around and think, oh, we can't even dare to use our imaginations to test different ideas. You make no progress doing that. That's called dogma. Stranginess says we didn't know bacteria and microbes exist until we had microscopes. Well, they were believed. Many people believed that such things did exist before we had microscopes. That's a fact. In many cultures, they believed that there were tiny organisms that we couldn't see. So, no, these things were believed long before we had microscopes. Imagine, very rarely do I hear something from like mainstream television with regards to science that is sensible. But there was a time, I'll never forget it because it was one of the few times I've heard something sensible. But it was one of the mainstream TV stations in the UK, BBC, ITV, or whatever. And there was some science program on. They were in some science lab, wherever it was. And they asked this scientist, what's the most important thing that you need? What's the most important attribute that you need to be a good scientist? The person didn't say, you need to be a maths genius. The person didn't say you need to be, a physics genius or whatever, right? They said the most important thing to be a great scientist is to have a good imagination. Bam. There it is right there. That is the most important thing to being a good scientist or a great scientist, is having a great imagination. Because everything starts in the mind. Before you even have any evidence, a lot of the time. It starts as a thought in the mind, a notion in the mind. And those tend to be the real mavericks and the trailblazers and the people who kick things on, are the people who dare to use their imagination and don't get caught up in dogmatic thinking of, oh, we can't prove it yet, so we can't say, I don't even dare to entertain a possibility because we can't prove it. It's just backwards thinking, man. The imagination comes first before everything. Casa says science seems to be a closed capitalism or establishment only venture nowadays, when collectively the greatest mind should be creating wonders, not drip feeding us tech. I agree. LD says, do you think clairvoyants are real? I think there is some truth to it. I am 100% convinced that some people have psychic abilities because I've seen it firsthand. And I'm a logical person. I'm not somebody that will just believe something wholeheartedly like that without seeing plenty of, persuasive firsthand evidence. I can believe it and say, well, I suspect it's true, but what I saw convinced me beyond any reasonable doubt in my mind. Now, I can't tell you because I can't prove it to you. So I can't tell you, oh, it's definitely a fact. I don't have the experiments that can show you it, or any of that. But I have seen for myself, for my own mind, that it's absolutely a real thing. It's absolutely a real thing that some people can know things before they happen. I've spoken about this many times, even in previous streams. There was an ex-girlfriend of mine who never claimed to be psychic. She never wanted to be thought of as psychic. She used to hide it. But the amount of times, things would always come to her in dreams. She would have these dreams where she would see things before they happened. And it happened so many times that it was way beyond the realms of coincidence. I mean, like way beyond what could be coincidence. And it was very specific stuff over and over again over the course of like 4 years. And that was the first time in my life when I became convinced that, clairvoyance, if you want to call it that, precognition was real. Was when I dated that girl. I was like, wow, this girl can actually see things before they happen. Not all things. You couldn't see what the lottery numbers were, but, certain things usually to do with people in her circle and what have you. She could see things before they happen. Again, usually in dreams. She'd have a dream and she'd wake up and she'd start telling me about the dream. And then what she told me about the dream, a couple weeks later would actually happen. So don't ask me how that works. Maybe it's to do with a lot of this weird stuff in quantum physics relating to the nature of time. Somebody mentioned the movie Interstellar earlier on. And one of the reasons I like Interstellar so much is because it explores the non-linear nature of time in a different dimension or whatever, right? Time is not necessarily linear. Everything exists all at the same time. Now, if our consciousness exists in that space, right, in non-linear time, then it would make sense of why some people who are sensitive to these things can perceive things or know things before they happen, right? If the consciousness itself is, operating in a different dimension or a non-linear, I don't know the right scientific terms to use to accurately describe it, but hopefully you understand the concept. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I like sci-fi, actually, because sci-fi explores so many different possibilities. And yeah, I like the way they depicted it in Interstellar. The scene near the end of the movie. If anybody who hasn't seen it, I won't give away any spoilers, but it's like a visual depiction of somebody in the fourth dimension, outside of linear time, existing outside of linear time. So he's in non-linear time. So again, that's an interesting idea. If consciousness exists in that realm, then it would make sense why people can see things before they happen, Or some people. And of course, governments have taken psychics seriously enough to actually recruit them. Intelligence agencies have taken psychics seriously enough to recruit them and do experiments on them. So yeah, consciousness is a very, very mysterious thing. Bob says, my mother got a lot of closure from a psychic who gave her a message from her deceased sister, but I've always been convinced the psychic was prepped by her friend with the info. Well, there is definitely a lot of fraudsters, who set themselves up as mediums and psychics and all that because they're trying to make money. So of course there are going to be fraudsters. You can't see anything in the future or whatever. In fact, I'm sure there are far more fraudsters than genuine psychics. In terms of the people who, are said to be psychic. I would imagine the majority of them are fraudsters. Yeah, but Devin, that doesn't explain why consciousness exists. That doesn't logically explain why it exists. You're talking about emergentism, but again, that doesn't explain why consciousness, like in science, they try to find a logical explanation for why everything exists in biology, right? There is no logical explanation that science has ever been able to come up with for why, because consciousness is not some, little side note. It's like the core of who we are, right? Why do living things need to be conscious? So science says it's just an epiphenomenon of the brain. It's just basically an accident. This accident has happened, which has made us self-aware. And consciousness allows us to become, no. No, it doesn't come close to explaining why it exists. What's the purpose of it? The only place where you'll find any more plausible theories, they don't describe them as theories, they dogmatically describe them as the truth, but the only way you'll find any interesting, plausible theories for this is in the realms of spirituality and religion for why consciousness exists. And from a logical perspective, again, I can't prove it, but from a logical perspective, it makes far more sense to me, this notion that exists in religion and spirituality, that consciousness is actually who we are. The physical body is an avatar. The brain is some kind of transmitter receiver of consciousness. It's not the thing that generates it. And especially when you look into like near-death experiences, of which there are millions, and I've seen countless accounts from people who are not religious at all, that have been through these out-of-body experiences, and what particularly out-of-body experiences. For me, the weight of evidence is far more suggestive that consciousness is not localized to the body. It's not produced by the body. That in fact, it is, again, tuned in. It's something that is tuned into by the body rather than generated by it. That to me makes far more logical sense than it's just some epiphenomenon, that just occurred for no reason by accident. Nah, that doesn't make as much logical sense to me. Whereas the brain being a receiver transmitter of consciousness makes more sense. Now, the nature of how that consciousness manifests behavior, or the nature of the behavior which is manifested by the consciousness, you could then say, well, maybe that's the influence of the genetic matter, right? The chemicals and so on and so forth, the DNA. But what actually animates the body? Yeah, you could say it's electrical impulses and all this type of stuff. Well, you can take a dead body once it's completely flatlined and gone and put as many electrical impulses in it as you want. You're not going to bring the person back to life. There is something that was in there that's no longer there. And if you follow it through metaphysically, there's no way that science can explain what is going on there. They can tell you the what, they can't tell you the how. If you follow it through, as I say, to its metaphysical conclusion. But in spirituality, they tell you that the body is like a conduit for consciousness, for spirit, soul, however you want to describe it. That makes more logical sense to me. Yeah, because then it's got a reason for existing. Yeah? Now it has a reason. Whereas the other explanation is just some kind of accident. No. Devin, I suggest that you look more into out-of-body experiences, because there are literally millions of out-of-body experiences which cannot be explained by just the brain. Yeah, we know the brain releases chemicals when a person is close to death. That doesn't explain how somebody who has been close to death and is later, revived, can describe looking down at themselves and describe details of what they saw from the bird's eye view, accurate details. Nothing that science has ever said explains how people can do that. And I've personally, heard many, 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 many of these accounts. There's probably millions of accounts like that. Yeah. And one of the most profound ones that I saw was this guy who was not spiritually inclined or religious at all, some well-to-do guy in America. And he picked up the receiver of his phone and lightning struck, I guess, the aerial or whatever, or the top of the house. And he was struck by lightning through the phone receiver. Yeah. And the next thing he remembers is he got jolted back. And then he was disoriented and he found himself at the top of the stairs looking down, and there was somebody on the floor. And he saw family members and people rushing, and he was confused. He was like, who's that person? Why are they down there? What's going on? And he could literally remember details that he couldn't have possibly known when he was lying on the ground unconscious. I've seen enough accounts like that to strongly suspect that consciousness is not localized to the body, that it can actually detach, from the body. So I would suggest you look into those accounts, because on YouTube, there are literally probably thousands of them. Yeah. I always mention another one because this is an individual who you'd imagine is, is operating at a very low level of intelligence and consciousness, right? There's a rapper / roadman, former roadman called Young Spray. He's now got a podcast. Yeah. He nearly died in a stabbing incident. It might have been 7-8 years ago. And years after he had that incident, he finally spoke about it. And he said he had an out-of-body experience where when he was on the ground after he'd been stabbed up and he was bleeding all over the place, he said he was up high looking down. I mean, there are too many people who have this exact same experience, yeah, where they can look down on themselves when they're close to death and recall actual details from that perspective. Well, that's a good question, John Jay. What about sleep? Where does consciousness go? That kind of speaks to what I was exploring earlier on, as far as, precognitive ability. What if consciousness exists in, this probably isn't an accurate way to describe it, but since we're all laymen here, what if consciousness exists in the fourth dimension? What if consciousness exists outside of linear time? And maybe that's where consciousness goes, or what our consciousness interacts with when we sleep. Because it actually makes sense, because our perception of time is totally different when we sleep, isn't it? You could go to sleep for like 10 minutes. And if you get into a deep enough sleep in that 10 minutes, you would think that you were asleep for 10 hours. You go into some dream that feels like, an adventure. And when you wake up, they're like, oh, you're only asleep for half an hour. But you went on some kind of epic adventure because the sense of time, the perception of time is totally distorted and different inside the dream than it is when you're conscious. And even, of course, your sense of time when you're conscious feels different all the time as well, right? But yeah, it may be the case that no, Devon, no, you haven't looked at enough of the cases that I've looked at. If you're saying something like that, no, no, that's not even close to being a feasible explanation for all of the out-of-body experience cases that I've heard and looked into. Not even close. I mean, for example, there was one out-of-body experience case that somebody had where they were in the hospital and they nearly died on the operating table. They saw themselves actually outside the building, looking down on the top of the building. They saw a tennis ball there, a yellow tennis ball. And when the person was revived, they started, when they were revived and resuscitated, they started speaking about their experience. And they described that there's a ball on top of the roof. And when somebody went to go and check, indeed, there was a ball on top of the damn roof. If you actually look at, see, as a scientific-minded person, you're supposed to go and look at the evidence. Well, there's the evidence right there. Is all of these accounts of people who have had these out-of-body experiences. You have to actually analyze the evidence first, rather than dismissing it right away. And there are literally thousands, probably millions, and definitely millions of cases where people have had these out-of-body experiences, and it's always the same thing. Floating up above, looking down, and they can recall details accurately. If it was just, their imagination, they wouldn't be able to record accurate details. They wouldn't be able to tell you who did what and who said what. They wouldn't be able to do that. Yeah, particularly who did what. People that are standing far away from them and then come from this place, they won't be able to do any of that. But this is what you get when these people are having these out-of-body experiences. As I say, you need to look into these cases. Or maybe it will frighten you, I don't know. Dominic A says, Partridge had an out-of-body experience in the 12th round of Wilder 1. Anyway, peeps, I'm going to shut this one down. Prepare for landing. Fasten your seatbelts. Seats in an upright position. We'll be touching down at our destination very shortly. The local weather is hot and sunny. I'd like to shout out each and every one of you for joining the conversation. Special shout out to those who donated via Super Chat. They were D-Man, KB, Danny, Charles B, AJ, Copzilla, Bobs, Agni, Debiarka. All right? Until next time, take care, be good, take it easy. And if you get it easy the first time, get it again. I'm out.